Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another edition of Friday Night Live on Friday, the 13th of December, 2024. I'm your host, Abdul Akbar, and we're beaming out to the good people of Luton and surrounding areas tonight, and also to the good people of Nottingham, Sheffield, Derby, Peterborough, and the Midlands, and across the UK through our partner station. So welcome to all of you tuning in on the radio, and also welcome to you if you're tuning in live on our various channels online. Tonight, we've got an action-packed program for the next hour. We're talking, of course, about the biggest news story of the week, which has been the fall of the tyrant Bashar al-Assad. We're going to be talking to him and his guests. But most importantly, are we talking to him, Zabasab?
You won't be talking to him, but you're talking to his
We
guest.
can't find him. We don't know where he is because nobody knows where Bashar al-Assad is.
He's in Moscow, allegedly.
Allegedly, but there's been no pictures, there's been no videos of where this tyrant is. So we're going to be trying to play Find the Tyrant. So if you do know where the tyrant is, 01582 481 822. Let us know if you've had any sightings of this thing called Bashar al-Assad, who's now a figment of a terrible figment of everyone's imaginations. That's coming up, but we've got an awesome guest for you. I'm going to be introducing him in about a minute's time, and he is Sami Hamdi. We're delighted to welcome this very special guest to Friday Night Live, and we're very lucky to have him on this program, and we'll be speaking to him in a moment and introducing him properly. Also coming up in the second part of tonight's program, roughly half an hour's time, we're going to be talking about whether or not we are more connected or more isolated in the age of technology. We've got an awesome guest lined up for you, Brother Osman, who has been in the technology field for 29 years, Rasab. That's almost as much as you.
Not quite.
Not quite, really?
No, not quite.
So it doesn't
Sorry,
quite your record.
you can't take that away from
Really?
me. Not quite.
Zafar Saab has been in technology for 100 years.
Yeah, closely.
All right, there we go.
Yeah.
Since the dinosaur age. There we go. Anyway, lots coming up tonight, but I've got to say the top story, of course, has been the fact that the tyrannical dictator Bashar al-Assad has fallen, and everyone has been celebrating. I've got to say, one thing that stood out to me, Zafar Saab, was the collection of luxury and classic cars. I think there was a CNN article on this a few days ago where they were walking through one of his many garages and were showing not just his Lamborghinis and his Ferraris, but his vintage cars that he had amassed on the back of the wealth of the Syrian people.
Absolutely. Well, it's a typical trait of a dictator, really, isn't it? They've got the power and they've got the public's finances at their fingertips, really. No accountability, and they do what they like, really.
There you go. Well, let me go ahead and introduce a guest who has probably a lot more to say on this topic than we do, and that is our guest, Sami Hamdi. Sami Hamdi is the editor-in-chief of the International Interest, an experienced geopolitical risk consultant. He's extensive experience in the Middle Eastern and North African region, having been a television reporter and also talk show host for over 10 years. Sami, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome to Friday Night Live. We're delighted to have you here, and thanks for your time this evening. Let me ask you, Sami, first of all, your reactions, and we probably know your reactions already, but I'd love to get your very quick reactions to the past week and what you've observed, and of course, the fall of Bashar al-Assad.
Thank you very much for having me. I think the first thing to note is that it took everybody by surprise. I don't think anybody was expecting it, certainly in the near future. I think there was a suggestion that this was becoming a frozen conflict. The mood was that there would be a reconciliation of Bashar al-Assad, the rehabilitation of Bashar al-Assad. He was in Riyadh for the Arab Islamic Summit. UAE were talking about reinvesting. Even Turkey's Erdogan was talking about, getting Assad to come to Ankara to talk about how to reconcile between them. And Syria had become an example in the Muslim community of why one should not revolt against a tyrant, why one should not do a revolution, why you shouldn't do a rebellion, and that somehow a tyrant in power is better than the chaos caused by a revolution. In the space of 1 week, there's been this spectacular collapse of the Assad regime for a number of reasons. Maybe we can go into those later, but certainly it took everybody by surprise. And I think suddenly the possibilities in the region look much more than they did 1 week ago. And suddenly there is a sort of renewed optimism that maybe destiny for this region looks brighter than perhaps we've considered it to be over the past 10 years.
Yeah, really well said there, Sami. And do you know what? This renewed optimism, I'm curious about that, because to be honest, I would love to know your analysis on what has changed over the last 10 to 15 years. Because if you think about it, I feel as though the West saw Bashar al-Assad 10 years ago, and the Gulf countries saw Bashar al-Assad 10 years ago, and not much has changed, at least from what I can see from my vantage point, compared to where he was then and how he was just only a week ago. But suddenly you've got leaders like Keir Starmer and Joe Biden and every leader under the Western sun saying, oh, he was a tyrant, he was an evil guy, we're glad to see the back of him, he did this, he did that. But he was doing that years ago and for years and for decades. The Assad dynasty, as you know, has been doing this for 50 plus years. So what's changed? What caused all these Western nations to suddenly start talking negatively about Assad and calling him a war criminal when he's been doing these war crimes for over a decade? What's your take on that?
I think one of the things that is worth noting is that when the Arab Spring took place and started toppling a lot of the dictators in the region, Ben Ali, Mubarak, NATO stepped in to get rid of Gaddafi, and then Ali Abdullah Saleh fell in Yemen. And then you have Bashar al-Assad came under threat from the Syrians, who also took to the streets, hoping to do an Arab Spring of themselves. I think the Arab Spring took everybody by surprise. I'm from Sidi, my father is from Sidi Bouzid, where the Arab Spring began. And if you had told me that Sidi Bouzid, my father's hometown, would be where the Arab Spring began, I'd have laughed at you. It's a town where you can see the end from as soon as you enter the city itself. It's not a place you'd think would do an Arab Spring, but often extraordinary things come from seemingly ordinary places. But the thing that I want to say is that when the Arab Spring initially began, it took everybody by surprise, including the Western states. The US did not know how to react. Neither did France, neither did Europe. No one saw it coming, and no one essentially understood what was happening. And as a result, there was sort of a period of independence where the chains were suddenly off. And then we had these elections that took place in the region. When the elections took place, the primary beneficiaries of those elections were Islamist parties, or let's call them pro-Islam parties, parties that would say openly that Islam should have a role in the state. And this is what caused a shift in the Western stance from being pro-democracy to anti-democracy. The results of the elections were contrary to what the Europeans and the Westerners were expecting. They were expecting secular liberals to win. They were expecting those who are anti-religion to win. Macron told Le Grand Continent, a very prominent magazine, in 2020, that we were surprised that the elections in the region exposed regressive tendencies, meaning that these populations that voted freely still wanted to vote for some sort of Islamic governance or Islamic rule. When Syria popped up, what happened was, because of what the Westerners had seen, or Europe and US had seen in Tunisia and in Egypt and in Libya, where the pro or Islamist parties, let's call them Islamists because later on some of them weren't necessarily as Islamic as we thought they were, but in any case, with the success of these pro-Islam parties, or ostensibly pro-Islam parties, meant that in Syria, the calculation changed. We once believed that Assad was a tyrant, but that tyrant is better than Syrian freedom. That tyrant is better than letting Syrians choose. That tyrant is better than allowing a free Syria, which might elect parties that believe in very different values from that which we are espousing. And as a result, we saw the Americans refuse to give Syrians weapons that they asked for. We saw Qatar and Saudi Arabia start to clash with one another over who should form the opposition. We saw the Saudis and others start to bring in factions that had no weighting in society, but they were not necessarily pro-Muslim or pro-Islam, and therefore they could be marketed to Washington and marketed to the UK, and that resulted in a very disintegrated opposition. And this is what changed in the 10 years was when the Americans or the Europeans believed, when crunch time came, that it's better for Assad to stay than to go. It's the Iranians and the Russians that did the legwork. The Iranian militias kept Bashar al-Assad's government up, and Russia helped to bomb the living daylights out of the Syrians to make sure that they would not rise up against Bashar al-Assad. And this is the point I want to make here. It's the dynamic of Iran and Russia which has changed. As a result of Iran going up against the Israelis battered the Iranian proxies, battered Hezbollah in Lebanon, battered a lot of the Iranian militias that were based in Syria. And as a result, those militias that kept Assad up, that kept him over the Syrian people, because they believed that an Assad tyrant was better than a free Syria that would reject an Iranian project of subjugation on Syria, those Iranian militias ended up being weakened. So Assad could not call upon those foreign powers that would keep him in power. And the Russians believed or they knew that Assad was not standing because of Syrian support. Assad was standing because of Iranian support. And Erdogan of Turkey, in my opinion, managed to convince the Russians that their long-term interest is not in defending a tyrant like Assad. He's going to go, and that the Iranians can't defend him anymore. Cut your losses, and rather instead go along with this wave of momentum that suddenly the Syrians have suddenly embarked on, and that will be better for you long-term. And now we're hearing reports that perhaps Jolani and the groups that entered Damascus are showing a more favorable tone towards the Russians as a result of that particular stand.
They
but
are.
the answer to your question is two dynamics changed. The first is the weakening of the Iranian militias, and the second is the Russians giving up on Bashar al-Assad.
Very interesting. Thank you for that, Sami. And Zafar, I want to come to you for a moment. One of the big stories, as Sami mentioned, there was definitely the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the main sort of rebel group that's been fighting in Syria, and the main group that actually, took Damascus when it fell around this time last weekend. I'm curious to know the posturing of the British government. Have you noticed how people are asking the British government and other Western countries, because Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they're a proscribed organization, they're an illegal organization in the UK, or terrorist organization. Do you reckon, from what you've seen so far, that the British government is going to open its doors and work with them rather than labeling them as terrorists? Because I don't see the verbiage coming out of the leadership, or the newly forming leadership, doesn't seem to suggest that they're terrorists, but actually want to make sure that they come across as diplomats, as politicians, and people who want to really work for the Syrian people. What's your analysis so far?
I think just seen a headline today. I think one of the ministers or somebody from the government saying that just because it's a proscribed organization doesn't mean that we don't talk to them, which means that there is conversations going on, there is dialogue going on. Whether that extends to support for the new guys, that remains to be seen. I think it's early days. People are assessing where this new group pitches itself. I think it has been making positive noises which the West like, but also it has a history, and people are aware of its history as well. But I just want to add, basically, these events of the past week or so. There is an element. I mean, Sami's mentioned the fact that Israel was bombing certain elements within Syria and within Lebanon, and I think the events that followed with the fall of the regime is actually giving Israel something positive to brag about. Israel was losing badly, in my opinion, right, in its offensive, a year-long offensive in Gaza. It had achieved nothing apart from mass killing. It hasn't even retrieved its hostages, and this collapse of the regime and this, I guess, victory, so to speak, of these groups has given Israel something of a positive, and it's allowed it to destroy the infrastructure, and I would say potentially claim large swathes of territory in southern Syria, almost sort of linking it to the 10th region, right, which is occupied by the Americans.
They bombed the hell out of Syria, right?
That's right.
The infrastructure,
and they have, and they've claimed large swathes of territory. And I would even claim that they've actually potentially reached up to the 10th region, which is the oil-producing region of Syria. So it's actually gained something from nothing. But having said that,
so tactical moves,
having said that, pleased, I guess, in some ways for the Syrian people, they seem to be happy. We just hope that this new group actually delivers on the aspirations of the people of Syria.
Let's see what that means. But it is interesting. It was quite frustrating to see, at least from my perspective, that the Syrian infrastructure was being blown to bits by Israel, especially parts that they could use to defend themselves, like the Navy, for example, and legitimate sites. I mean, Israel claimed that they were bombing chemical factories and other stuff, but coming from Israel and its current track record of genocide and what we've seen happening to the Palestinian people and the Lebanese people, I find that very far-fetched, and I find it very hard to believe what the Israeli government comes out with these days, and certainly what the IDF comes out with these days as well. They just lost all credibility on what they're up to, but clearly they're doing strategic moves. Let me take this back to Sami. Sami, thanks once again for joining us. We're really delighted to have you on this program. Sami, your analysis on HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and where you think they're going to evolve, because one of the things we've seen on the Western narrative this week is, yes, the horizon looks bright, but there are dark clouds overhead. Dark clouds meaning, the history of HTS, where they're coming from, what they used to be. They used to be a part of Al-Qaeda and so-called Islamic State, and they were kind of split away from those organizations and created a more quote-unquote moderate version of what they're trying to do. What's your take on HTS, and do you think they'll be successful in forming a government, or do you think they'll be treated like the Taliban are in Afghanistan, saying, okay, you guys are too quote-unquote Islamist, so therefore we recognize you, but we're not going to support you or fund you in any way, shape, or form?
I think at this moment in time, there's a lot of testing in terms of what HTS actually stand for. I think the Israelis panicked when Damascus fell and immediately crossed over to invade Syria. There was a sense of peace with Bashar al-Assad. There's reports that Assad worked with the Israelis to give them the positions of the Iranian militias as well. You'll notice no missiles did not come from Syria, and the reports are emerging from Lebanon, from Hezbollah officials, that Assad refused to allow it because he didn't want the Israelis to attack. I think the Israelis are panicking. They're bombing the air bases and the navy in Syria because under Assad, they were no threat. Under HTS, they will become a threat. Under Assad, the Syria army, we are safe and we are at peace with them. Under HTS, they might actually be a threat. And that's why I'm very wary of this idea of the axis of resistance. Assad was not an axis of resistance against those the Israelis themselves. And I think that's why Israel is pushing. It's like pushing further in and telling the Americans, I need an extra buffer zone, because with the Golan Heights, I had a peace agreement with Bashar al-Assad. I don't trust these guys, and we should not allow them to have any weapons through which to attack us. The reason HTS are unable to respond to the Israelis is because the Americans are now aggressively pushing on the northeastern side where the oil is. They're pushing the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, otherwise known as the separatist Kurds, the YPG, PKK, Marxist leftist Kurds. They don't represent the Kurds, but they are Marxist leftist Kurds, supported heavily by the US. They survived by the US, a group that makes Erdogan very angry. And now they are lobbying the US and Israel, who are pressuring HTS, to grant these separatist Kurds an autonomous region in the northeast, so that HTS remains paralyzed in that it will have no army, because we could trust Assad, we can't trust HTS. It will have no means to attack the Israelis, and no oil, because it will be under the autonomous region. So automatically there's a scramble already to try to paralyze the HTS, which is why today we saw the head of Turkish intelligence and the Turkish foreign minister Hakan Fidan and Ibrahim Kalin go to Damascus. They met with Jolani. The Qatari intelligence chief has gone to Damascus to discuss how to counter these two threats. There's negotiations that have opened up with those northeastern separatist Kurds, which is why today we've seen at the UN, the Syrian official under the orders of Damascus has raised a complaint demanding that Israel now withdraws. They were quiet for a week because they wanted to focus on the SDF. Now there's talk about how to focus on the Israelis in and of themselves. I think the fear that did not exist under Assad, but that now exists under these people who are now controlling Damascus, the fear in Tel Aviv, the fear in Washington, I think that is what will make things complicated in terms of forming a governance. The one thing that does suggest optimism with regards to forming a government is the way in which Jolani appears to be quite decisive in terms of what he's doing. He's already brought 27 factions under the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. He's kept the peace between these 27 factions. He's installed the Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir. This Prime Minister gave the khutbah today in the Umayyad Mosque. It appears that other groups, the Druze, the Christians, have come out openly and said that they've treated us well and we don't necessarily have a problem with Jolani and the like. We've seen other minorities come out and say that we're safe. There hasn't been any looting. There hasn't been any killing of us. In fact, we find it better than Bashar al-Assad. We've seen the opening of the prisons and we've seen the images inside, which has won a lot of goodwill among Syrians who believe there's genuine change that is starting to take place. I don't think Jolani will have a problem forming a government. I think he will have a problem exerting Syrian sovereignty as Israel tries to make sure in its lobbying to the Americans that this is not Assad. Assad, we had to deal with him. Assad was not a threat to us. Assad could have an army, but we knew he would never use it. These guys will actually use it, and that's why I fear that the obstacles will not be domestic. The obstacles will be internationally, particularly given that, and I finish on this particular point, particularly given that you have also now the Saudi Arabia and the UAE as well, who believe that with the way that Assad has fallen, that might cause repercussions across the region. Remember, we were in a region 2 weeks ago where we said change was impossible, and there's no point bringing change because it brings chaos. Not only do you have a tyrant falling, but you also have the prospect of international recognition of those who came after him. And this is Syria. This is not Tunis, which is a small country. This is Syria. And the maxim always goes that the liberation of Palestine, the road goes through Syria. And the free Syria will be a threat to the Israelis, but also a threat to authoritarian regimes. All of these pressures, only Allah knows how Jolani and the others will handle them.
Wow, I would say, Sami, honestly, and not bigging you up too much, but I'm just saying that's the best analysis of the geopolitical dynamics I've heard all week. So thank you for that. I'm going to come back to you in a second, because Sami hit the nail on the head there,
Absolutely.
which is if I was MBS or if I was part of the Al Maktoum family in the UAE, I'm going to be thinking, I'm going to be having sleepless nights right now, thinking, you know what, if I've got these guys on my doorstep, as Sami quite rightly said, Syria, Bashar al-Assad, he had the infrastructure, he had the weapons, he had the navy, but he wasn't going to use it against them anytime soon. He was almost like a stable entity, right? You knew what he was going to do. You knew your enemy. Yes, he's just sitting there and he's quite happy to stay there and manage his domain. These guys, if they get too comfortable, HTS I'm talking about, and any administration connected to them, they may actually have other wider ambitions as far as the Gulf leadership is concerned. So how serious do you think?
I think that it is serious, to be honest. I think they're very sensitive to any notion of any representative government in that region, especially the UAE and the Saudis, to be honest.
Yeah.
So they will be reacting with some level of alarm. But the dynamics, I guess, which led to collapse of the Bashar regime, they're not there in Saudi. They're not there in UAE, because I think largely they've kept their public happy, through, I guess, financial means, etc. So there is no immediate threat, but it is a threat. I think that the regime will be seeing.
I don't know.
They'll be seeing it as a threat, and they'll deal with it.
My earpiece keeps coming out. Do you know what? But I got a hypothesis here, a prediction, right? I reckon either MBS is going to want to create an ally out of this new Syrian quote unquote government, or he's going to want to create an enemy or disruption and to install his own puppet government that's going to work according to his plans. Everyone's going to be thinking we need to create some kind of allyship or create enemies, right?
It depends on what shape of government ends up in Syria. If it's an authoritarian government, then they're likely to become allies. But if it's a representative government, a government which is representative of the people and the people are happy with, then likely the other.
Let me get the last minute over to Sami. So Sami, last thoughts from you before we take our break, and appreciate your time. Just a quick minute we've got left, but what's your hypothesis in terms of next steps and the strategic moves you reckon the Gulf states will make? Do you agree that MBS may be having some sleepless nights right now?
In Libya, the UAE was one of the prime proponents of getting NATO to bomb Gaddafi and to get rid of the regime. And they put themselves on the side, quote unquote, of the revolutionaries and the rebels. As soon as that was done, they succeeded in creating an alternative entity known as General Haftar. They supported him and they set up a rival government in the east, and Libya remains embroiled in civil war. I think that the Saudis are deeply concerned, and I think the proof is the constant arrests of everybody who tweets something that is necessarily against bin Salman. The idea being that it is so tense in Saudi Arabia that even a tweet that criticizes a Jennifer Lopez concert or Nicki Minaj or these others will cause an arrest of somebody. They have to either party or they have to shush. And I think it shows the concern amongst Mohammed bin Salman himself that Saudis do not like me. And the UAE is aware. Emiratis are not happy with me. And therefore, to have a successful, free Arab country where people actually decide and that decision becomes successful is a very grave threat. The UAE ambassador is alleged to have met or as part of an entourage of ambassadors with Jolani and the groups that entered Damascus. There is an emergency meeting to be held in Jordan with Arab states. Qatar will participate, so will UAE, so will Saudi Arabia. But as we've seen in history, the greatest threat never comes from the outside. It always comes from inside the clan, from inside the tribe. Yeah. And I think that the greatest threat to Damascus is not Israel. That's an open enemy. It is not the Americans. We know what to expect. The greatest threat will be that the Muslims that he is expected to rely on will be the ones who will vie to remove him, because their very existence or their very power rests on him failing, not succeeding.
Sami Hamdi, we really appreciate that analysis, and thank you so much for your time once again, joining us here on Friday Night Live. Jazakallah khair. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much. All right, listeners, this is Friday Night Live with me, Abdul Akbar, and Zafar Iqbal Saab. We're going to be taking a short break. What an amazing analysis. We're going to be debriefing on this analysis, Zafar Saab and I, after some very short messages. Coming up after the break, we're talking about whether or not we are isolated in a more connected world. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Stay informed, entertained, and engaged. Check out our new website, inspirefm.org.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Friday Night Live. My name is Zafar Iqbal. Welcome to our listeners based here in Luton and the surrounding areas, and our listeners in Peterborough, Sheffield, Nottingham and Derby through our partner radio stations and through the internet and various social media channels that we have throughout the world. Welcome to the show. Welcome indeed. Today's topic, we're going to start off today with the discussion where we left off last week in terms of what's happening in Syria and that region, including Lebanon, Palestine, etc. And in the second part of the show, we'll be talking about a more light-hearted, I guess, less but equally important, less serious but equally important subject about natural human nature. Is it good or naturally bad? Are we born good or are we born bad? We're going to be talking to a specialist in that area. We'll be talking to a psychotherapist and an Islamic counseling specialist. To start off the program today, we're going to be talking, like I said, about Syria. We're going to talk about it's an update of Syria. We're going to talk about, I guess, if you've been listening to radio, television, etc., you will know that there's been seismic change in Syria. The al-Assad family, which had ruled Syria for over 50 years, came to an abrupt end a couple of weeks ago. Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafiz al-Assad, who ruled for almost 30 years, left the country to rebel forces who were opposing his rule, who initially started off as a political movement, but which turned into a military movement. And if you know the history of Syria, you would know basically that for the last 10 or so years, there's been a very brutal civil war in Syria against what was then the Bashar regime. That Bashar regime is no more. New leadership has come into play, and so the leadership is former rebels, basically, who have taken over. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the implications of the change of leadership in Syria, for the region and for the world, I guess, and also what it means for the Syrian diaspora. So joining me today, we have Sarah Lee Wilson. She's the executive director of Dawn, and previously she worked and served as the director of Human Rights Watch Middle East. Very well qualified to talk about the Middle East situation. Can I welcome Sarah? Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hi there. I was just looking for my microphone and I can't find it anywhere.
I can hear you perfectly well. Thank you. Welcome to the show. I wanted to sort of ask the question. I guess there is a lot happening in that region. Syria is one hotspot. We have Gaza and Palestine, another burning issue in that area, and also Lebanon. If we can start off with, I guess, picking up from where we left off last week, the catalyst for change in Syria. What, in your mind, was the catalyst for the change of I guess, leadership and governance in Syria?
Well, the immediate catalyst, of course, was Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's forces marching out of Idlib and into Aleppo, and then proceeding to Homs and Hama, and finally Damascus with virtually no resistance. In fact, I don't even think we need to say virtually, with no resistance. The Syrian government's security forces evaporated. They put down their weapons, and I don't even know if a single bullet was fired when they first even marched into Aleppo. The reports indicate that they just drove in sedans, families alongside them, returning home. So that was sort of the immediate catalyst. But I think the real catalyst was Russia and Iran refusing to defend the Syrian regime, withdrawing their own forces, and Hezbollah withdrawing its forces, the remaining forces it had, basically leaving the country defenseless. I think that there was a very clear decision on the part of the Syrian regime not to resist. It seems pretty apparent that there was a pre-agreement that Bashar would step aside, and I believe he left for Moscow immediately, or just in the first day or days, along with his family and some close family members. So clearly there was a decision on the part of the Syrian government to step down, to not resist, and to abandon the country.
If I can bring in Saqlain Imam, he's a London-based former BBC senior journalist and current affairs correspondent. Saqlain, do you agree with that assessment? Do you agree that it was as it was described by Sarah?
Sorry, I just joined, so I couldn't listen to these things, please.
So the question really is the catalyst for change in Syria. What was the catalyst in your mind? Actually, if I can just ask, there's an article in Reuters today written by Sami Hamdi, who's the Reuters editor for Middle East. She claims basically that Israel is claiming the victory in Syria. Would you agree with that? Would you agree that Israel, could and is, I guess, rightly sort of assumed to be able to take that viewpoint?
I think it's too early to say that somebody has got victory in any part of that Middle East, because Israel has failed to eradicate Hamas so far, despite huge bombing, massacre, and destruction of buildings and bombing, some of the worst or most devastating missiles. It has failed to eradicate Hamas, number one. Number two, it failed to capture even a name-worthy village in South Lebanon. So what it has achieved, Israel, what it has achieved, or the backers of Israel have achieved, devastations, and devastations.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing strategically they have achieved. So any war which is fought always sets some goals for itself. And the goals which Israel had set itself, right from the beginning, which it has set for itself, were to eradicate Hamas and release of its hostages and save that southern part of Israel. And then when it started, military incursions in South Lebanon, it said it wants to actually save these northern Israel areas and degrade Hamas position. So nothing has been achieved so far.
Would you agree? Would you agree that Israel's bombing of southern Lebanon and I think Syria, when Assad was in power, basically broke the back of the support network basically for Hamas?
No.
Would you agree?
No.
And
I can't agree with it because if it's too early, as I said. By bombing Lebanon or by bombing anything, it did not degrade the support or supply systems of Lebanon, or southern Lebanon and Hezbollah. Because if you remember, in 2006, Lebanon's Hezbollah fought that war on its own. There was no significant supply chain. There was no reinforcement. Rather, it was a time when Iran wasn't able to supply anything at all. All flights coming from Iran or Tehran to Beirut were cancelled. And Israel was constantly watching the borders between Syria and Lebanon. So if you keep that example of 2006, you can very well imagine in 2024, that Lebanon's Hezbollah can fight for a long time without any fresh supplies. Because the difference between the military supplies or weaponry supplies of Hezbollah, its difference from Israeli military supplies is that Israel is carrying out its war with the best and the latest technologies and weaponries supplied by America. On the other hand, Hezbollah or Hamas, both, they have been using military, equipments or bombing, military hardware of the lowest level of technology, but very effectively.
So, would you concur? Would you agree with that assessment? Would you agree with the assessment that has been made in terms of the claim that was made in Reuters that Israel had a part to play in?
Oh, yeah, I wasn't sure which part of the assessment you were asking me to assess. What he said. I mean, clearly, Israel has gained an advantage in Syria. I don't think there's any disputing that, particularly if you look at it in the context of their efforts to defeat what they call the so-called axis of resistance. They have demolished Hezbollah in Lebanon. They have successfully demolished or seen the demolition of the Syrian government. And their next sights now are on Iran, which has always been their objective. It has always been their goal. This war has never just been about Hamas and Gaza. It's always been about finding an opening to achieve their final goal of taking down the Iranian regime. So clearly this is a moment of success for Israel. However, and of course, to say nothing of the territory of Syria that they've now occupied and have said they are going to permanently occupy, going beyond even the already stolen lands in the Golan Heights. So clearly they have the upper hand. They are in a victorious position across the region. If you compare it just to a year ago where they stood. However, as we all know, there's a lot of the unexpected in the Middle East, and what will emerge in Syria may well be a worse threat to them, a more aggressive threat to them than the feckless government of Bashar al-Assad. And if you look at the history of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, if you look at the history of Jolani's background, he is literally a Golani and literally cut his teeth and first became politically aware and conscious by witnessing Israel's atrocities during the Second Intifada, as well as the constant incursions into Lebanon, into Syria. So, either they are going to have a less friendly regime or less compliant, less accepting regime in Syria under a leadership that includes Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or, and I think this is frankly even more likely, their persistent, relentless bombardment of Syrian defenses, Syrian military bases, Syrian weapons will result in anarchy and chaos in Syria and make it a failed state that will have multiple militias with multiple agendas that will be very hard for the Israeli government to contain. So that's also a possibility. But right now, I think it's very clear that Israel has the upper hand.
But Golani, if you touched on Golani and the task he has on him, basically. So some of the noises he's been making, do you think he's coming across as a fighter or a political figure in the making? And do you think he's got what it takes to actually navigate through the complexities of that region, basically?
Well, I mean, for the past several years, and I think this goes back at least 5 years, Jolani has been rebranding Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as not associated with Al-Qaeda, as fighting ISIS, and as kind of jihadi light. One of the most important points that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has emphasized for the past several years is that they have no transnational ambitions. They are not looking to export their rebellion beyond the borders of Syria. And that has been the main selling point that has led advocacy groups or think tanks, even in the United States, to advocate doing business with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So a few years ago, you might recall, the International Crisis Group actually proposed to the United States and to the international community that they start establishing relations with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham because, well, they're not so bad, because, well, they're not transnational. So I think that suggests that Jolani is willing to cut deals with neighboring powers to give them the assurances they want that they are in no way seeking a global jihadi movement or even a regional jihadi movement. Furthermore, sorry, let me pause.
Sorry, carry on, finish your point.
I think furthermore, we don't know everything that went down. We don't know everything that's gone down in Syria in the past month. We can speculate that there was a very clear deal cut with Russia, Turkey, the United States, and Israel. With Russia, my suspicion is hoping that it will satisfy Trump by giving up Syria in exchange for keeping chunks of Ukrainian territory. That's my preliminary assessment. Do I have this solid evidence to back that up? No. Is that what it looks like to me? Yes. It was a very precipitous decision by Russia to, without announcement, without sort of feelers, saying, okay, actually, we're gone. And the timing certainly suggests that. Now, yeah.
Indeed, I think so, some of the noises coming out of Moscow seem to indicate that as well. So I just want to bring in another guest. I've got Dawn Chitty, who's the Emeritus Professor in Anthropology and Forced Migration at the former Director of Refugee Studies at Oxford University. Welcome, Dawn, welcome. I wanted to just digress slightly from, I guess, more to a human question, really, in terms of the impact that the war has had on Syrian people, is likely to have, and just your thoughts basically on the diaspora, the people who are forced to leave Syria, and what the impact on them is. Is it something that they could perhaps seek comfort in, a joy in, and return back, or do you think there's still some work to be done before they could return back to their nations?
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me this evening. Let me just go over a few figures for you. Before 2011, Syria had a population of between 22 and 23 million. In the 13 years that this uprising has turned into a revolution that has been successful, and I have to say, HTS should be regarded as liberators, however you want to look at the political landscape. But in these 13 years, what you've seen is about 7 million Syrians internally displaced. In other words, they've had to leave their homes and their villages to other parts of Syria. You have 4.9, or rather I should say just about 5 million Syrians in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, all of them poised to return when the situation is considered safe. And you have a total of about 1.3 million in Europe and in other parts of the world. This successful routing of the Assad regime that's lasted, not 13 years, but 54 years, has left a lot of people surprised, as Sarah has mentioned earlier. But it means that you have this very large number wondering when they can go back, when it might be safe, or when it might be possible. Now, the issue here is that in these last 13 years, basically, Assad, Bashar in particular, has basically destroyed the infrastructure of much of the country that's even under government control. The area under control by Ahmed Shara, I would prefer to use his proper name rather than his pseudonym.
Al-Jolani.
Well, Al-Jolani, the family may have been from Jolan, but they're a very big family in Damascus, a very well-respected family, very deeply embedded in the medical profession. The way in which the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham managed the Idlib province which grew from 2 million to 4 million during these 13 years. And keep in mind that many of those who came into Idlib came in unwilling. These were the defeated fighters, many of them foreign fighters, some from Chechnya, from the Caucasus, from Tajikistan, from Afghanistan. So many of them also extremists or more radical fighters pushed into Idlib by government forces when they were defeated. So he had to find a way of managing the administration of Idlib province. I would say he did really quite well. Yes, of course, it was authoritarian. Yes, of course, he had to arrest those who were not prepared to go by the rules that were set down in order to manage the civil society in Idlib. But that's only one small area. Even then, the region was constantly being bombed by Russian and Syrian air force. They were often targeting schools, they were targeting hospitals, they were targeting residential areas. So basically, Syria does not now have the infrastructure to see, for example, 5 million Syrians suddenly return from Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria. That would not be a safe return. And even though 15 European countries have begun to talk about, what shall I say, freezing or suspending asylum applications. And some of these countries are talking about now returning, deporting back to Syria, which incidentally is totally against their international treaty commitments under the 1951 Geneva Convention, which prohibits return to areas that are not safe. So I think we have to wait and see. It's something that is going to happen not overnight, but I think it's going to take months, if not even a few years, before there is an infrastructure in the country that would permit very large numbers to return. And again, there's another issue that, the transitional justice process, it needs to be set into motion. Otherwise, peace in Syria will not be sustainable.
But there is, I guess, a lot of interest in people wanting to return back. It is, I guess, videos on social media indicating people have gone back to look at their former places of residence, actually, which have been demolished, etc. But are you able to gauge what kind of interest there is? People are still looking out and checking to see whether it's safe to go back or not, or do you think people are taking a risk and going back in case they lose what they used to have, perhaps?
Well, I think that Ahmed Shara has made it very, very clear that property that was confiscated during these certain years by the Assad regime is going to be returned to its owners. So there is this issue of returning, and I would suggest that it may now be the right time for the UNHCR, the UN Agency for Refugees, to consider putting into place the same kind of mechanisms that were agreed during the Dayton Accords for Bosnia. And just to remind you that this was very, very carefully negotiated, in which Bosnians who wanted to go back to their country to assess whether it was safe to bring their families were given a certain amount of money so they could go back, take a look, then come back to their families and make an informed decision as to whether to return. Now, I can say I have a large number of doctoral students and master's students here at the University of Oxford who are from Syria. Some of them are refugees, some of them are not. Particularly those from the southern area of Syria, from the Druze majority areas. They are all talking about how they hope that people will make informed decisions about going back, but not rush back. However, the situation in Lebanon and in southern Turkey are quite critical. I mean, the Lebanese have been talking for months and months about pushing Syrians back across the border. And I think we saw images of many, many Syrians waiting to get across the border, as there were also Syrians trying to leave who were not 100% sure that the country wasn't going to descend into chaos. So there are people rushing back, but many, many are waiting in order to make an informed decision as to whether this is the right time.
Sarah, if I can bring you back in terms of the development effort that's going to be required, who do you think is actually going to be engaged enough to invest in the country in order to rebuild it again? Are there people queuing up? Are there countries queuing up to invest in the country, or is this going to be a wait and see what sort of government that comes up?
Probably there will be a lot of wait and see. Syria obviously has oil assets that it can sell, and there will be international oil companies that want a further stake. I don't know what's going to happen with the existing contracts, the existing development of oil. And so that should give the Syrian government some leverage. I don't know who's going to want to come in and rebuild Syria, because despite its small amount of oil, it's a poor country, and the country right now is fairly bankrupt, particularly at a moment in time when Gaza is going to probably take precedence and priority for rebuilding. We hope.
Indeed. So Claire, just final 30-second few words from yourself in terms of what you think the outlook is for Syria.
I think we haven't learned any lesson from Libya. That is, we saw a regime change with the help of these militants or Islamic jihadists. What happened to that country? We are still seeing bad effects of that experiment.
Okay.
And the same is likely to happen in Syria, whether they are Russian-backed, American-backed, or Israeli-backed. Every will fight. Syria doesn't have an army now. Everything is.
We're gonna have to stop there. Thank you very much. Jazakallah, thank you very much. We're gonna have to take a short break. Thank you for your contributions, and hopefully in the next show we'll take things further.